Hi, this is Attorney Joe Fieschko. Today I'm going to talk about work-related hearing loss in Pennsylvania. And basically, this occurs when you lose some of your hearing, um, usually because of very loud noises at work. You work in heavy industry, and even though you're wearing hearing protection, over the years, that loud noise makes you lose your hearing. There are also some cases where the hearing loss is caused by a single event, whether it's an explosion or head trauma or something along those lines. That is another area, but most commonly, these cases are from long term exposure to hazardous occupational noise, as it's called. I can tell you that a lot of the things I do in my practice, things like bankruptcy and wills and estates and auto accidents and workers' compensation, things along those lines, estates, a lot of lawyers do. Two areas are kind of specialties that not a lot of lawyers do. One of them is unpaid overtime cases. That's an area that most lawyers don't know much about. And this is the other one, work-related hearing loss. It's a kind of a specialty that I do, and I've had, as of this program, 956 of these cases in my career. I know that because I keep them on the computer and keep track of such things. So anyway, these cases are not unique to the state of Pennsylvania. All 50 states allow recovery for work-related hearing loss. That would include West Virginia, Maryland, Ohio, all the surrounding states. If you're a federal worker, if you were like a federal mine inspector, we've gotten hearing loss for those people under the federal system. If you work on a dock, primarily around here, those would be people that are making or repairing barges on the Monongahela River. They're under the Longshore and Harbor Workers Act, so that they allow that under that system. Railroad workers can recover. So this is a well-known fact, and there's recoveries pretty much no matter where you work in the United States of America. In Pennsylvania, the story kind of began in 1995. Prior to 1995, we had a law, but it wasn't based on science, and it was a terrible, terrible law. Essentially, if you lost your hearing for all intents and purposes, you could file a petition, and if you won, you got 260 weeks of benefits. Now, today, the top rate is $1,023 a week. So if you won, you get around $300,000. If you lost, you didn't get anything. And the science was nobody loses their hearing entirely from noise. It's very similar, frankly, to the kind of hearing loss you get when you get old. If you're in a room full of 90-year-olds, they can hear, but they can't hear very well. That's what you get from noise. So as a result, again, before 1995, most judges wouldn't award anyone the benefits because scientifically it was impossible. Some judges were very lenient. The judge in Beaver County at that time awarded it every time I filed a case over there. And honestly, he put a lot of businesses out of business. There was just no justice either way. If you wanted it, there was no justice. If you lost it, there was no justice. Also, there was no statute of limitations. So a client could be down in Florida and hadn't worked for 20 years, and he could file one, and it was perfectly fine. So it was an absolute mess, and Governor Ridge changed that. He came in with Act 1. Governor Ridge has always had a hearing loss. He's always worn hearing aids, so I think it was kind of close to his heart. It's the first thing he ever did as the governor. And the new system was based on science. Thank goodness. And it's pretty straightforward. We use the American Medical Association formula. I get my client's hearing tested. Now, if you have your hearing tests at work, bring them in and I'll tell you your percentage loss. If you don't have them, doesn't matter. I send you to Dr. Rogerson, who is an ear, nose, and throat doctor out in Johnstown. Over the years, I've used various ear, nose, and throat doctors, but over the years, they've retired or died. So Dr. Rogerson's the only one that's left right now. So you go there, and the law provides that if you have under a 10% loss under the American Medical Association formula, there's no case. So he tests you, or frankly, sometimes guys come in, and usually it's men, by the way, come in with their hearing tests, and if your latest hearing test was 0% and you just retired, then I don't even make you go through anything. I just tell you the news. If you're over 10%, then Dr. Rogerson will write a report, and I will immediately file a claim petition. So on the other end of things, if you have over a 75% loss, you get 260 weeks of benefits. It's the old rule. Now, that's almost impossible to do. In my career, I've had 2 people out of the 956 that had over 75%. And those cases obviously are worth a lot of money. You get $300,000. I get 20%. You get 80%. There's no tax on it. It's just a big check. So the bad news is you're really deaf. But the good news is you got a lot of money out of it. But that is extremely rare. What normally happens is my client will be between the 10% and 75%. And the award is eventually that percentage of the 260 weeks. So if you have a 10% loss, you get about 26 weeks of benefits, all in a hunk of money, not a strung out. 20% is 52 weeks, 32% or 30% is 78 weeks, if my math is correctly. So as you can see, the worse your hearing is from the work, the more money you get, which is the way God planned it, shall we say. Okay, that's fair. Now, the employer never just pays. They don't. I don't send them a report and they say, okay, here's the check. They will. I file the petition right away. There's a hearing a month after the petition's filed. My client testifies. There's not much to the testimony. I work for Consolidation Coal for 30 years and I can't hear. And it was noisy. Then they will send you to their doctor. Historically, they've used Dr. Chen. Now Dr. Chen's getting older, so they're using another doctor who's his partner named Dr. Hillman. And they supply transportation. They don't make you drive into Pittsburgh. They'll go pick you up and drop you off. And usually their doctor will agree with my doctor in terms of the percentage. These are pretty objective tests. Usually they are about the same. A lot of times their doctor will say, well, it's due to old age. Usually, by the way, these guys are in their early 60s, so, most people in their early 60s don't lose their hearing, but that's their argument. Or maybe you cut your grass. Most of the defenses are silly. The one that is worth something is if the client has a hunting history. If you are right-handed, you shoot from your right shoulder, and your right ear is protected by your head, but your left ear gets the noise from the gun. So in those cases, a lot of times we'll see the left ear is substantially worse than the right ear, and a lot of times that will be due to hunting, because I see that very, very commonly. Now, with work-related hearing loss, it's fairly easy to see because that kind of hearing loss has some very distinct characteristics. And it's basically the same thing that we get when we are getting older. And with age, I'll talk about that a little bit. These losses are called sensorineural hearing losses. And to distinguish it, there's two kinds of hearing losses. One is conductive. Conductive, a good example of that is someone who's deaf from birth. Somewhere between the ear and the brain, part of that railroad track is out. Nothing ever gets through. They live in silence. You can have a conductive loss that's partial, that's due to autosclerosis or something like that. Obviously, that's not related to noise at all. What happens with age or noise, with age, we have these very sensitive nerve endings in our ears. And as I'm speaking and as you're listening to me, all I'm doing is sending out these pulses into the air. You say, no, you're not, you're talking. Well, that's not what your ear says. Your ear says, no, all I'm getting are pulses on these little nerve endings. And they are so precise that they wiggle in a certain way. And based on the way they're wiggling, your brain converts that to words and to ideas and everything else. And it's kind of a miracle when you think about it, although we all take it for granted, very much so. The time that you don't take it for granted is when you're dealing with one of these systems on the telephone that you have to speak to a computer and it has to understand you. And those have gotten a lot better over the years, I'll tell you that. But you can probably remember when they first started using them, it was for directory assistance, which people don't use at all anymore. But in those days, you would say the person's name, and you'd say it, and you'd say it, and you'd say it, and they couldn't understand it ever. And then a human being would get on, and you'd tell them the name, and they'd tell them the phone number. Now the systems are better. It's also better, frankly, in the dictating systems that attorneys like me use called Dragon, where now when you dictate into your dictaphone, it just types it out. So that has gotten better. But what I'm trying to get back to is it's a bit of a miracle how our ears work in conjunction with our brain. So it happens when you're exposed to noise over the long term, that beating, day in, day out, makes your ears older. So you might be 60 years old, but you've got the hearing of a 90-year-old. Very same thing. It's called a sensorineural hearing loss. The characteristics are it's binaural. Obviously, if you're working with noise all around you constantly, both ears are getting hit at the same time, so you get it in both ears. Both ears are usually equally bad. That's called symmetrical. And here's the most telling and unique thing. Your hearing, you first lose it at the higher frequencies in work-related hearing loss. So sometimes when I'll get a 40-year-old coal miner in, he will have what's called a high-frequency loss, but it begins at the 4,000 level. And the AMA formula does not take that into account. So they'll have a 0% loss, even though they have a loss at the 4,000 level. What you need are losses at the speech levels, because the AMA says, the most important thing about our ability to hear is our ability to hear human speech. Because if you can hear human speech, you're in good shape. If you can't hear the highest note on a piano, well, that's too bad. But really, the most important thing about our hearing is hearing other people talking. So a man with a deep voice is at 500 hertz. The my voice is around 1,000 hertz. A female voice is around 2,000 hertz, and a 3,000 voice is a little kid's voice, basically. So a lot of times, usually these are people in heavy industry. Usually they're men. Often they come in with their wife, and the wife says, "Well, he can hear his pals at the bar fine, but he can't hear me." Well, that's because it's true. He can hear at the 500 and 1,000 level, but he can't hear his grandkids and he can't hear the wife. That's just the science of it. So quite often, that's how that winds up. Um, so, uh, who gets this? Well, I'll tell you a funny story. Out in the country here, it's fairly common. Um, uh, in the cities, it's very, very less common. So if I get an Allegheny County judge, they're not as familiar with these cases. A couple of years ago, a judge was transferred from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, and she started getting these cases. And I filed one in the first hearing. She goes, "Oh, well, I've never had one of these cases." She said, "I didn't know they even filed them anymore." And it's like, lady, we've, filed 956 of them, and most of them have been successful. So anyway, this is an area that's very common out here. The biggest group is coal miners because nowadays it's all mechanical, of course. So they've got the continuous miner and all those other machines. And if you work in the coal mine long enough, you're going to lose your hearing. So a lot of the people come from the Cumberland mine in Greene County, the Enlow Fork mine, the Rocks Coal over in Somerset County, some other coal mining operations like auger mining and things like that. Once in a while you'll see these cases are from other coal mines. So that's the biggest group of people. If you are working on barges, then that is a very noisy occupation, and you can file either under Pennsylvania State Workers' Compensation or Longshore and Harbor Workers. And that gets to one of the things you have to keep in mind. In Pennsylvania, there's a 3-year statute of limitations. So if you're listening to this program and you retired 10 years ago, I can't help you. You are too late. It has to be filed within 3 years of your last exposure to the hazardous noise. So if you got put into an office 10 years ago because you were a smart guy and didn't have to work out in the mill or out in the coal mine, or you got put in the washroom because you've got an injury, you may be out of time because it's 3 years from the date of the last exposure. And you don't have to be in the noise 8 hours a day, but you do have to be in the hazardous noise within 3 years of the last date last date that you were in the hazardous noise, within 3 years. The longshore workers, there is no statute of limitations. So they have the old system where the statute doesn't begin to run until a doctor tells you that you have work-related hearing loss, and obviously you don't hear that until you go to me and I send you to a doctor and the doctor tells you. So that's a difference, but most of you be wary of the 3-year statute of limitations. Also, historically, people with hearing loss don't know they have a hearing loss. So sometimes it's the wife or the friend or the sister that calls me and says, he doesn't think he has a hearing loss, but let's get it tested. And we get it tested, and sometimes they don't, but sometimes they do. So coal miners are the biggest group. Factory workers, if you work at a cement plant, that process is extremely noisy. Quarries, I've had mechanics that work in very noisy environments. In a couple of industries, there's a lot of noise, but not as many cases, and I'll tell you why. In the fracking industry or boilermakers, Sometimes these folks have a lot of hearing loss, but I have to show that you lost at least 10% of your hearing at one employer. And if you are a boilermaker, or this goes for construction workers too, if you're a boilermaker, you usually are working at a power plant your whole life, and if it's the same power plant, you're all set because you've been working for one employer. And also, if the company was sold, normally the new company picks up the old company's liabilities. But some of these guys are moved around. So if you worked a couple months here, 2 years there, 6 months here, I'm not going to be able to show that 10% was lost at one employer. Similarly, sometimes the fracking cases are very noisy, but they're shorter term jobs. Now that we've had fracking around here for a long time, I do get people that have worked for the same company for many years around the noise, and those are good cases. The same goes with construction workers. If you've worked for the same company for many, many, many years and you've lost your hearing because of the noise, you're all set. But if you've bounced around and worked for different employers, maybe you've even been self-employed at some time, then you're not going to be able to show that 10% was lost at one of the employers. So the way we do it is you call me up. Normally I'll get you in the office, either in Uniontown, Somerset, or Pittsburgh. We'll set you up with a hearing test, and I pay for it. And you go and you get your hearing test, and if it's under 10%, that's it. If you're over 10%, we just file the petition right away. A month later, you have your hearing. Then they get your hearing tested. Normally, these things are mediated. They're settled because there's not a heck of a lot to fight about. These checks come in one lump sum. There's no tax on them. There's a 20% attorney's fee deducted, and that's that. Now, by the nature of this particular kind of case, people usually do it when they are either laid off. Now, this hasn't happened for a while now around here, but mine closes. Now, all of a sudden, I got a ton of cases. But you retire, which, of course, there's a certain turnover in these professions. And why do you do it then? Well, first of all, people are a little reluctant to bring a comp action against their employer unless they have to. They think there might be repercussions. Sometimes, they say, hey, I really liked working there. I really like this employer, and I would feel weird filing an action against them. So that's one reason people usually put it off till they retire or get laid off. The second reason is that's when you're going to reach your maximum hearing loss. If you come in and we get you hearing loss for 20%, then you work another 5 years, maybe you've got 25% then. So you haven't filed at the proper time. I can tell you that you are allowed to go back to the well in a situation like that, where you get 20%, you work another 5 years, but you have to show an additional 10%. So, and I've had that in a few cases where people wanted to do it early, and you can get the additional money if you have, in that instance, 30% at that time. So when people come in, they normally are in their early 60s, sometimes later 60s, sometimes late 50s, but they're basically of retirement age. And a couple of other things that I check at that point are, first of all, a lot of times when people that have worked in heavy industry all their lives, they're all beat up. And in their early 60s, maybe they take their Social Security at age 62. And, you take a big bite out of yourself if you do that, because if you wait a year, you get 8%. If you wait another year, you get 16% more per month. And that goes on till 70. So the smart play, if you can afford it, is to put off taking your Social Security until age 70. Well, what happens in heavy industry is usually the man comes in and he's retired at 62 because he can't do it anymore. He can't be a steel worker or coal miner. He's had ruptured discs or he's had broken this or broken that. He's beat up. It's time to go. Well, here's the smart thing to do at that point. If you're 62 and you take your old age Social Security at the low rate, um, also apply for Social Security disability at the same time that you apply for old age. Because if you win Social Security disability, and it's pretty easy to do when you're 62, they bump you up to the 66-year-old and 10-month rate, which is called the full rate. So it's something like, if my math's correctly, it's like 32% more per month for every month for the rest of your life if you get on Social Security disability instead of old age Social Security. Now, usually when these guys come in, like most human beings in America, we haven't saved enough for retirement. So you get a hunk of money out of the hearing loss case. You get Social Security disability that bumps you up to age 66 years and 10 months. Sometimes we try for black lung, but we're really not successful very often with those things. And if you have a workers' comp case, I had a coal miner last year that had a serious work injury, and he was in his early 60s, and we settled that case for a lot of money. He got work-related hearing loss, which was a lot of money. And then he got it on Social Security disability, which even though he was 62, it knocked him up to the big rate. So that's kind of the perfect way you like to handle them. Now, the other kind of case is where it's trauma. I had a fracking case one time where a guy was directing traffic at a fracking site and some idiot put a train horn on his truck and blew it in my client's ear, completely destroyed the hearing in one ear only. And with that one, you get 60 weeks of benefits for a complete loss of hearing in one ear. We've had those from explosions. We had one from head trauma. I had a case some years ago up in Somerset where I had a poor guy that was very, 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 very seriously injured in a truck accident. He broke his neck, but it was worse than that. It was just horrendous. And they wanted to settle his case for a ton of money. It was actually like $700,000. And he was actually had made some good recovery. And I think they wanted to get rid of him because they'd spent $1.2 million in his medical. So they wanted to get rid of him. But anyway, so it was a good idea for him to settle. He had Social Security disability. So while I'm talking to him, a hearing aid falls out of his ear. And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, I lost my hearing in this one ear in this accident too." So we got him another hunk of money based on his the loss of hearing in the one ear. So that can happen in these cases. Finally, once in a while, maybe 1 in 1,000 people has a hearing loss from something else. Dialysis causes hearing loss. If you take too much Viagra, if you take too much oxycodone. I've never had either of those two, but I have had the dialysis stuff. And of course, the hunting can skew the results a little bit in the one ear. But anyway, this has been Attorney Joe Fieschko. If you or a loved one has suffered a hearing loss, give me a call, 1-800-242-2412. And thanks for listening. Ta-da. All right.